The afternoon sun bore down on Ouagadougou like molten copper, casting harsh shadows across the sprawling construction site at the city's edge. Heat waves shimmered above the red earth, distorting the air into liquid ribbons that danced between the skeletal frames of rising buildings. The temperature had climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, and there was no relief in sight. Dust hung everywhere, thick ochre-colored dust that coated everything it touched. It settled on the workers' forearms in grainy layers, accumulated in the creases of their necks, and clung stubbornly to their sweat-soaked clothes. The taste of it was metallic and unavoidable, coating tongues and teeth, mixing with the salt of perspiration that ran in rivulets down weathered faces. The construction site was a symphony of labor. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of shovels biting into packed earth provided a steady baseline. The creak of wheelbarrow wheels protesting under loads of cement and sand added a higher pitch. Hammers rang against metal, voices called out measurements and warnings, and beneath it all was the constant shuffle of feet, the grunt of exertion, the breath of men pushing their bodies to the limit. Ibrahim Traoré, the site engineer, was a man who commanded respect through presence alone. At 42, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had clawed his way up from poverty to prominence. His shoulders were broad, his face angular and weathered by years under the African sun. He wore a yellow hard hat that had faded to pale gold. And his boots, sturdy leather things that had cost him two weeks' wages when he first became an engineer, were caked with the same red dust that covered everything else. He paced the perimeter of the foundation trench with the measured stride of a general inspecting troops. His eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. When a worker's shovel stroke looked lazy, Ousmane was there with a sharp word. When a wheelbarrow was not filled to capacity, he pointed it out with barely concealed irritation. "Faster!" he barked, his voice cutting through the din. "We have 2 more loads before lunch break, 2 more!" The deadline will not wait for tired men. The workers, 23 in total, responded with renewed vigor. They knew Ousmane's reputation. He was fair but unforgiving. He paid on time, but he demanded excellence. In a country where jobs were scarce and families depended on every franc earned, no one wanted to risk dismissal. Ousmane wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dirt across his forehead. He squinted against the glare, calculating time and productivity with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built his career on delivering projects ahead of schedule. This particular site, a new administrative complex for the district, represented his largest contract yet. Success here meant more contracts, more money, more security for his family. He thought of his wife, Mariam, and their 3 children waiting at home in their comfortable house in the better part of town. He thought of the car he'd purchased last year, the enrollment fees he'd paid for his eldest daughter's private school, the dignity he'd earned through hard work and determination. Nothing could jeopardize that. Nothing. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. Workers drank water from shared jerry cans, poured it over their heads, and returned immediately to their tasks. There was no time for rest, not when Ibrahim Traoré was watching. It was approaching 11 o'clock when a shadow appeared at the construction site gate. Isaka Sawadogo stood at the edge of the construction site entrance, his thin frame almost swallowed by the harsh midday light. He was 38 years old, but hardship had aged him beyond his years. His cheeks were hollow, carved out by hunger and worry. His eyes, once bright with youthful ambition, had dulled to a weary resignation that came from watching dreams crumble like dry clay. His shirt, once white, now a patchwork of stains and repairs, hung loose on his skeletal frame. Every rib was visible through the threadbare fabric when he moved. His trousers, held up by a length of rope because the button had fallen off weeks ago, were torn at both knees. His feet were bare save for a pair of rubber slippers so worn that his toes touched the ground through the holes. Isaka's hands trembled as he stood at the gate, not from fear alone, but from the weakness that comes from 3 days without a proper meal. His youngest child, Marie, only 4 years old, had cried herself to sleep the night before, her small stomach cramping with hunger. His son Mamadou, 7 years old and trying so hard to be brave, had asked in a small voice, Papa, when will we eat again? That question had broken something in Isaka's chest. He was a father. His job was to provide, to protect, to ensure his children never knew the gnawing pain of starvation. Yet here he was, helpless and desperate, reduced to begging for work at construction sites where supervisors looked through him as if he were invisible. His wife, Aminata, was at home with their children and his mother. His mother, the woman who had raised him alone after his father died, who had worked her fingers to the bone to send him to school, who had believed he would make something of himself, was now gravely ill. She lay on a thin mattress on the floor of their one-room dwelling, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body ravaged by an illness they couldn't afford to diagnose, let alone treat. Isaka had sold everything. First, the small radio that had been his father's. Then the cooking pots, one by one, until only a single dented pan remained. Then his wife's wedding jewelry, the gold earrings she had treasured as her only inheritance from her grandmother. She had handed them over without complaint, her eyes dry because there were no tears left to shed. But the money had run out. Landlords didn't accept promises. Pharmacies didn't dispense medicine on credit. And children, innocent and trusting, couldn't understand why their bellies hurt so much. So Isaka had walked. He had walked from his dwelling on the outskirts of the city, through neighborhoods that gradually became more prosperous, past houses with gardens and gates, until he reached the construction zones where he hoped, prayed, someone might need an extra pair of hands. He had been turned away from 5 sites already that week. Too weak, they said. Too old, too unreliable. Come back when you look like you can lift a bag of cement. Come back when you don't look like you'll collapse after an hour. But Isaka couldn't come back later. Later meant another day without food. Later meant his mother's condition worsening. Later meant watching his children's eyes grow dimmer with each passing hour. He took a deep breath, straightened his spine as much as his exhausted body would allow, and stepped through the gate. The noise of the construction site washed over him, sounds of productivity, of men earning their keep, of dignity through labor. He wanted that. God, how he wanted that! Please, sir! He called out, his voice barely audible above the racket. He tried again, louder this time. Please, sir! I'm looking for work! Usman Kabore turned, his eyes landing on the newcomer with immediate assessment and quick dismissal. He saw the torn clothing, the protruding ribs, the trembling hands. He saw weakness, liability, a man who would slow down his crew and disrupt his schedule. You look too weak for this work, Usman called back, his tone sharp and final. This isn't a charity organization. Go home and rest. You'll hurt yourself here. Isaka's heart sank, but desperation pushed him forward. He stepped closer, his hands open in a gesture of supplication that he hated even as he made it. My name is Isaka Sawadogo, sir, he said, and his voice broke on the words. My mother is very sick. My children haven't eaten for 2 days. I will do any job, sir. I can carry blocks, sweep the site, fetch water, anything. Please just let me earn enough for food today. I'm not asking for charity. I want to work. I can work hard, I promise you. Several workers had stopped to watch the exchange. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed the careful blankness of men who had learned not to let compassion interfere with survival. Usman felt a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or the ghost of his own hungry childhood, but he pushed it away. He had worked too hard to let sentimentality compromise his standards. Look, he said, his voice softer now, but still firm. I'll give you money for food and arrange a ride home, but I can't have you on this site. You're clearly unwell. You'll get hurt and then I'll have problems I don't need. Take the money. Go feed your family. Get some rest. It was a generous offer, more than most supervisors would provide. But to Isaka, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of his dignity. No, sir, he said, and his voice carried a quiet strength that surprised even himself. I don't want charity. I can work. I can learn quickly. I'm not lazy, sir. I'm just having difficult times. But I'm strong enough. Please test me. Give me one task, and if I can't do it, I'll leave without complaint. Usman's jaw tightened. He had a schedule to maintain, and this conversation was eating into valuable time. His patience, stretched thin by the heat and pressure, finally snapped. "You're wasting my time," he said curtly. "Move aside. We have work to do." He stepped forward to walk past Isaka, intending to return to supervising his crew. But Isaka, weak and dizzy from hunger, didn't move fast enough. Usman raised his hand, not to strike, but to push the man aside, to clear his path. The push itself was not violent. It was the gesture of an irritated man trying to remove an obstacle. But Usman's boot, in that exact moment, caught on a loose stone that had been dislodged from the path. Time seemed to slow. Usman stumbled, his arms windmilling for balance. His weight shifted awkwardly, all of it coming down on his right leg as he fell. He hit the ground hard, and his ankle twisted beneath him with an audible crack that made several workers wince. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Usman cried out, a raw sound of shock and agony. He clutched his ankle, his face contorted, and when he looked up, his eyes were wild with pain and something else, something darker. The construction site, moments before filled with the sounds of labor, fell silent. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward the scene. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the site exploded into action. Two of the largest workers, both men who had worked under Usman for years and owed their livelihoods to him, rushed forward. They grabbed Isaka before he could even think to step back, their hands like iron bands around his thin arms. "I didn't mean it," Isaka cried, his voice high with panic and genuine horror. "It was an accident, sir. I swear by God I didn't touch you. You fell on your own. Please, sir, it was an accident." But Usman, clutching his swelling ankle, his face twisted with pain and rage, was beyond hearing reason. The pain in his leg was real, sharp and throbbing, but the pain to his pride was worse. He, Usman Traoré, respected site engineer, had been brought down in front of his entire crew. Someone had to pay for that humiliation. "He attacked me," Usman shouted, his voice carrying across the site. "He pushed me. I told him to leave and he attacked me. Someone call the police, now!" "Sir, please," Isaka begged, struggling weakly against the hands that held him. "I didn't push you. I was just standing there. You fell." "Please, sir, I have children. I have a sick mother. Please don't do this." But his pleas fell on ears deafened by pain and pride. One of the workers pulled out a mobile phone and dialed. Within minutes, far too quickly for Isaka's racing heart, a police pickup truck arrived. Red dust billowing in its wake. 2 officers jumped out, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, their expressions businesslike. They assessed the scene with practiced efficiency. A well-dressed engineer on the ground, clearly injured. A ragged man being restrained by workers. The obvious conclusion. "This man attacked me," Usman told them through gritted teeth. "I told him to leave the site and he pushed me down. I want him arrested for assault." The officers didn't ask Isaka for his version. They didn't ask any of the workers who had witnessed the entire exchange. They simply pulled out handcuffs and snapped them around Isaka's thin wrists. The metal was cold and harsh against Isaka's skin. He felt the weight of the cuffs like chains, like the weight of all his failures pressing down at once. He had tried to find work honestly. He had begged for a chance to earn his dignity. And now he was being arrested for a crime he hadn't committed. "Please," he whispered one last time. But the officers were already dragging him toward the truck. "My children are waiting for me. My mother needs medicine, please." The crew watched in silence as Isaka was shoved into the back of the police vehicle. Most kept their expressions neutral, unwilling to risk their own positions by speaking up. But one young worker, Salif Dao, a man of 24 with an earnest face and eyes that hadn't yet learned to look away from injustice, muttered under his breath. "This is wrong," Salif said, his voice barely audible. He didn't do anything. The boss pushed him first. "I saw it." An older worker standing nearby elbowed him sharply in the ribs. "Shut up," the man hissed. "You want to lose your job? Keep your mouth closed and your head down." But Salif couldn't. As the police truck drove away, carrying Isaka toward a fate he didn't deserve, Salif felt something harden in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd watched his own father, a good man who'd made one mistake, be treated like a criminal. It was the feeling that had made him listen to President Ibrahim Traoré's speeches on the radio, the ones that spoke of justice and dignity for all citizens. The president had said, in one memorable address, every citizen has not just the right but the duty to stand for truth. Silence in the face of injustice makes us accomplices. If we want a better Burkina Faso, we must each have the courage to speak, even when speaking is difficult. Those words had resonated with Salif then, and they resonated now, echoing in his mind as he watched the dust settle where the police truck had been. That night, Salif lay awake on his thin mattress in the small house he shared with his wife, Awa. The single room was modest but clean, illuminated by a kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Awa slept beside him, her breathing soft and even. But Salif's mind churned with images he couldn't dispel. He kept seeing Isaka's face, the desperation, the hollowness of starvation, the trembling hands of a man pushed beyond his limits. He kept hearing the man's voice. My children haven't eaten for 2 days. Salif had children too. A daughter, Fatoumata, just 2 years old, who lit up his world with her smile. He couldn't imagine watching her go hungry. He couldn't imagine the desperation that would drive a man to beg for work in such a weakened state. Awa, he whispered into the darkness. His wife stirred, rolling toward him. What is it? Can't you sleep? I need to tell you something, Salif said, his voice low and troubled. Something happened at work today. He told her everything. He described Isaka's arrival at the gate, the plea for work, Ousmane's dismissal, and then the push that wasn't really a push, just a gesture, just bad luck with a stone underfoot. He told her about the false accusation, the immediate arrest, the injustice of it all. Awa listened in silence, her face growing more concerned with each word. When he finished, she sat up, pulling her wrapper more tightly around her shoulders. Salif, she said carefully, this is terrible. That poor man, but you can't get involved. Why not? Salif asked, though he knew the answer. Because we need your job, Awa said, her voice gentle but firm. Because speaking out could mean Ousmane fires you. Because we have Fatoumata to think about, and another baby coming in 4 months. Because these things, she gestured helplessly, these things happen, and they're wrong, but we can't fix them all. Salif sat up too, running his hands through his short hair. The president says we must stand for truth. The president doesn't have to feed our family, Awa replied, but her voice was sad, not angry. She reached out and took his hand. I love that you have a good heart, Salif. It's one of the reasons I married you. But good hearts don't fill empty stomachs. They sat in silence for a long moment, holding hands in the lamplight. Finally, Salif spoke again. If I do nothing, he said slowly, then an innocent man will suffer for a crime he didn't commit. His children will lose their father. His sick mother will have no one to care for her. And I will know that I could have stopped it, but I chose comfort over truth. He turned to look at his wife, his eyes earnest in the flickering light. How will I teach Fatoumata about right and wrong if I don't live by those principles myself? What kind of father will I be if I teach her that truth matters only when it's convenient? Awa's eyes filled with tears. She loved this man, this earnest, stubborn, good man who saw justice as something worth sacrificing for. What will you do? She asked quietly. I'll go to the presidential villa, Salif said. Tomorrow before dawn. I'll tell them what really happened. Salif, you can't just walk into the presidential villa, Awa protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I have to try, Salif said simply. If I don't, I won't be able to live with myself. They lay back down, but neither slept much that night. When the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Salif rose and dressed carefully. He put on his best shirt, the blue one Awa had ironed for him, and his least worn trousers. He wanted to look respectable, like a man whose word could be trusted. Awa made him tea and bread, and they sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, not speaking much, just being together. Be careful, she whispered when he stood to leave. I will, he promised, kissing her forehead and then bending to kiss his sleeping daughter's cheek. Then Salif Dao walked out into the cool morning air. his heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure, and began the journey that would test both his courage and his nation's commitment to justice. The bus to Ouagadougou's government district was crowded, as it always was in the early morning. Workers, merchants, students, and civil servants packed the aisles, swaying together as the vehicle lurched through the city's awakening streets. The smell of close bodies, cheap soap, and morning breath filled the air, but Salif barely noticed. He stood near the back, one hand gripping the overhead rail, mentally rehearsing what he would say. Would anyone even listen to him? Would they dismiss him as a troublemaker, or worse, arrest him for wasting official time? His stomach churned with anxiety, but beneath the fear was something stronger, a conviction that he was doing the right thing. The bus ride took an hour, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent. Modest concrete homes gave way to larger houses with gardens. Street vendors gave way to proper shops with glass windows. The road itself improved, the potholes disappearing as they entered the area where government officials and wealthy business people lived. Finally, the bus shuddered to a stop near the presidential compound. Salif climbed down, his legs slightly unsteady, and stood for a moment staring at the imposing gates ahead. The presidential villa was a sprawling complex surrounded by high walls topped with security wire. The main gate was flanked by guardhouses, and armed soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, their weapons held with practiced ease. The Burkinabe flag, horizontal bands of red and green with a yellow star, snapped in the morning breeze above the entrance. To most citizens, this place was as distant and inaccessible as the moon. It was where power resided, where decisions that affected millions were made, where ordinary people like Salif did not belong. But Salif had heard President Ibrahim Traoré speak many times on the radio and television. Unlike previous leaders who seemed distant and untouchable, Ibrahim had a way of speaking that made people feel heard. He talked about ordinary Burkinabés, their struggles, their hopes, their dignity. He had said more than once that his door was open to any citizen with a legitimate concern. Well, Salif thought, squaring his shoulders, let's see if he meant it. He approached the gate, acutely aware of the soldier's eyes tracking his movement. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to walk steadily without the nervous shuffling of a man who didn't belong. Two soldiers stepped forward, blocking his path. One was tall and broad-shouldered with tribal scarification marks on his cheeks. The other was younger, leaner, with alert eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Salif's appearance. "Halt!" the older soldier commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "State your name and business," Salif cleared his throat. "My name is Salif Dao, sir. I'm a construction worker. I've come to report an injustice. A man was wrongly arrested yesterday at the Cabaret construction site, and I witnessed what really happened. Someone needs to know the truth." The soldiers exchanged glances. They heard many strange requests at this gate, people claiming to have urgent messages for the president, people seeking favors, people with grievances real and imagined. But there was something in this young man's earnest face that gave them pause. "You can't just walk in," the younger soldier said, but his tone was less harsh than it might have been. "This is the presidential compound. You need an appointment, proper authorization." "I know, sir," Salif interrupted respectfully. "I know I don't have an appointment, but an innocent man is in jail right now, and his family is suffering. If I don't speak up, who will? The president says every citizen has a duty to stand for truth. Well, I'm here to stand for truth." The older soldier studied Salif for a long moment. He had been a soldier for 20 years, and he had learned to read people. This young man wasn't a troublemaker or a lunatic. He was genuinely distressed about an injustice. "Wait here," the soldier finally said. He turned and walked toward the guardhouse, speaking quietly into a radio. Salif waited, his palms sweating despite the cool morning air. Around him, the city was coming fully awake. Traffic increased on the streets. Vendors began setting up stalls. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. Salif began to wonder if he'd been forgotten, if the soldier was simply letting him stand there until he gave up and went away. But just as doubt began to creep in, the soldier returned, and his expression had changed. There was respect in it now, and perhaps a hint of surprise. "Follow me," the soldier said. "The president's chief of staff wants to hear what you have to say." Salif's eyes widened. He hadn't expected to get past the gate, let alone speak to someone in the president's inner circle. He followed the soldier through the gate, his heart racing. The interior of the compound was beautiful. Well-maintained gardens with flowering trees, neat pathways, buildings painted in clean white and green. It was orderly and peaceful, a world away from the dusty chaos of the construction site. They entered an administrative building and climbed a flight of stairs. The interior was cool, air-conditioned, and quiet. Salif's worn shoes seemed too loud on the polished floors. He felt acutely aware of his modest clothing. The dust still ground into the fabric despite his best efforts to clean it. But when he was ushered into a waiting room, and then, moments later, into an office, the man behind the desk looked up with an expression of genuine interest. "Not condescension, Mr. Dow?" the man asked, standing to shake Salif's hand. "I'm Colonel Bambra, the President's Chief of Staff. I understand you have information about a wrongful arrest?" "Yes, sir," Salif said, and then, encouraged by the Colonel's attentive expression, he told the whole story. He described Isaka's arrival at the gate, the desperation in the man's voice, the plea for work. He described Usman's initial refusal and offer of charity, Isaka's insistence on working rather than accepting handouts, and then the crucial moment. Usman pushing Isaka aside, stumbling on the stone, falling and twisting his ankle. "He didn't push the engineer, sir," Salif said emphatically. "The engineer pushed him and then fell because of a stone. But the engineer blamed Isaka, and the police arrested him without even asking what happened. It's wrong, sir. That man has hungry children and a sick mother. He was just looking for honest work." Colonel Bambra listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad before him. When Salif finished, the colonel sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is a serious allegation," he said. "You understand that you're accusing a respected engineer of lying and an innocent man of being unjustly imprisoned?" "Yes, sir," Salif said, meeting the colonel's eyes steadily. "I understand, but it's the truth. I saw it with my own eyes, and so did 20 other workers on that site. If you ask them away from the engineer so they're not afraid of losing their jobs, they'll tell you the same thing." The colonel nodded slowly. "Wait here, Mr. Dow." He rose and left the office. Salif sat alone, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, praying he'd done the right thing. What if they didn't believe him? What if Usman found out he'd come here? What if... The door opened again, and Colonel Bambra returned. But he wasn't alone. "Mr. Dow," the colonel said, "the president will see you now." Salif's mind went blank with shock. The president. He was going to meet President Ibrahim Traoré himself. President Ibrahim Traoré's office was not as grand as Salif had imagined. Oh, it was certainly official. There was a large desk, flags standing in the corners, maps on the walls, but it felt more like a working space than a throne room. Papers were stacked on the desk. A worn briefcase sat open on a chair. A simple ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. And standing by the window, looking out over the compound, was the president himself. Ibrahim Traoré was a young leader, only 41 years old. But he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned his position through merit rather than birthright. He was of medium height, with the solid build of someone who had known physical labor in his youth. His face was thoughtful, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind simple glasses. He turned when Salif entered, and his expression was warm, not the artificial warmth of a politician performing for cameras, but genuine interest. "Mr. Dow," Ibrahim said, gesturing to a chair, "please sit down. Tell me what you saw." For the third time that morning, Salif recounted the incident at the construction site. But this time, speaking directly to the president of Burkina Faso, the words came easier. There was something about Ibrahim's attentive silence, the way he listened without judgment, that made Salif feel heard in a way he'd never experienced with authority figures before. When Salif finished, Ibrahim was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled before him. "You understand," the president said finally, "that you took a significant risk coming here. You could lose your job. The engineer could make trouble for you. Yet you came anyway. Why?" Salif swallowed hard. "Because you said, Mr. President, that every citizen has a duty to stand for truth. Because if I said nothing, an innocent man would suffer. Because I have a daughter, and I want her to grow up in a country where justice matters more than convenience." A slow smile spread across Ibrahim's face. "What is your daughter's name?" "Fatumata, sir. She's 2 years old." "May God bless her," Ibrahim said. Then he stood, and his expression became serious. "You did the right thing, Mr. Dow. You exhibited the kind of courage that builds nations. Now let's go correct this injustice." Salif blinked in confusion. "Sir?" "We're going to the police station," Ibrahim said simply. "Right now. Prepare the convoy." He called to Colonel Bambra, who had been standing quietly by the door. "Mr. President," the colonel said carefully, "perhaps we should send investigators first. Verify the story?" "I believe Mr. Dow," Ibrahim said firmly. "And even if there's doubt, an accused man deserves to have his case examined properly. Justice delayed is justice denied. We go now." Within 20 minutes, a convoy of 3 vehicles was speeding through Ouagadougou's streets. Salif sat in the second vehicle, still dazed by the sudden turn of events. He had come hoping anyone might listen to him. He had never imagined the president himself would personally intervene. The Ouagadougou Central Police Station was a squat concrete building that had seen better days. Its walls were stained with rust and grime, its windows barred with thick metal. It was a place where hope went to die, where the machinery of law enforcement ground slowly and often unfairly. When the presidential convoy pulled up outside, officers poured from the building like ants from a disturbed nest. They scrambled to form lines, frantically adjusting uniforms and trying to look professional. The arrival of the president was unprecedented. Captain Ouedraogo, the station commander, hustled forward, his face a mixture of excitement and terror. Having the president visit was an honor, unless the president was angry, in which case it was a career-ending disaster. "Your Excellency," Ouedraogo stammered, saluting sharply. "What an unexpected honor. We had no notification of your visit." Ibrahim raised a hand, cutting off the nervous flow of words. "Where is the man arrested yesterday from the Cabaret construction site?" Isaka Sawadogo. "Bring him to me immediately." The captain's face went pale. Of course, Mr. President, right away." He barked orders, and 2 officers scurried into the building. Moments later, they emerged with a man between them. Isaka Sawadogo looked worse than he had the day before. A night in a police cell, no food, no water, no comfort, had further hollowed his already gaunt frame. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he shuffled forward with his head down, the posture of a man who had given up hope. Ibrahim stepped forward, and something in his bearing made Isaka look up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Ibrahim's face transformed with recognition and something deeper, shock, joy, and sorrow all mingled together. "Isaka?" he whispered. "Isaka Sawadogo?" Isaka's eyes widened. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Ibrahim?" he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "Ibrahim Traoré?" The president closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and pulled Isaka into an embrace, heedless of the dust and dirt, of the watching officers, of protocol and dignity. He held his old friend like a man holds something precious he thought he'd lost forever. "Uncuff him," Ibrahim commanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Now!" Officers rushed to obey, fumbling with keys until the handcuffs fell away with a clatter. Isaka swayed on his feet, and Ibrahim steadied him. Around them, the watching crowd, officers, civilians, Salif, Colonel Bambara, stood in stunned silence. "No one had expected this. How long has it been?" Ibrahim asked softly. 20 years? 23, Isaka said, and tears began streaming down his face. I didn't know it was you. They said the president, but I never imagined. Ibrahim turned to Captain Ouedraogo, and his expression was no longer gentle. "This man was arrested yesterday." "What was the charge?" The captain consulted a notebook with shaking hands. Assault, Your Excellency. The complaint stated that he attacked the site engineer, causing injury. Did you investigate this complaint before making the arrest? The engineer filed the complaint, and witnesses at the scene confirmed. Did you speak to all the witnesses? Ibrahim interrupted, his voice sharp. Or only to those the engineer directed you to? Silence. Did you ask the accused man for his version of events? More silence. Did you consider that a man who looks like he hasn't eaten in days might not have the strength to attack anyone? Captain Ouedraogo's face was ashen. Your Excellency, we followed standard procedure. When a complaint is filed by a respectable citizen against a poor man? Ibrahim finished coldly. Is that what you were going to say? That you believed a respectable engineer over a hungry man in torn clothes without even investigating? No, sir, I only meant... Ibrahim turned away from him in disgust and addressed the assembled officers. His voice carried across the compound, and more people were gathering, civilians attracted by the unusual sight of the presidential convoy. This is exactly what is wrong with our systems, Ibrahim said. And though he wasn't shouting, every word rang with authority. We have created a justice system where the poor are guilty until proven innocent, while the wealthy are innocent until proven guilty. Where a man's clothing determines whether his word is trusted. Where a procedure is an excuse for laziness and prejudice. He gestured to Isaka, who stood trembling beside him. This man, Isaka Sawadago, is my friend. We grew up together in the same neighborhood. We attended St. Michel Primary School together. He was brilliant in mathematics, always at the top of our class. He had dreams of becoming an engineer himself. Ibrahim's voice softened with memory. We lost touch after school, as people do when life takes them in different directions. I joined the military. He went his own path. But I never forgot him. And now I find him here, arrested for a crime he didn't commit, held without proper investigation, treated like garbage because he had the misfortune to be poor and desperate. He turned back to Captain Ouedraogo. I want a full investigation of this case. I want statements from every worker who was at that construction site yesterday. I want them interviewed separately, away from their employer, so they can speak freely without fear of losing their jobs. And I want it done today. Yes, Your Excellency, the captain stammered. Furthermore, Ibrahim continued, I want a review of every arrest made at this station in the past 6 months. I want to know how many other people have been detained without proper investigation. How many other Isakas are rotting in cells because it was easier to believe an accusation than to seek the truth. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You are officers of the law. Your duty is to protect all citizens, not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, but all citizens. The poor man deserves the same justice as the rich man. The hungry man deserves the same presumption of innocence as the well-fed man. If you cannot provide that, then you have no business wearing that uniform. The officers stood rigid, some with shame on their faces, others with resentment. But all silent, Ibrahim placed a hand on Isaka's shoulder. Come, my friend. You're coming with me. First to the presidential clinic for a medical examination and a proper meal. Then we'll talk about your family, your situation, and how we can help. Your Excellency, Isaka whispered, barely able to speak through his tears. You deserve dignity, Ibrahim said firmly. Every human being deserves dignity. You deserve justice. And as your friend and as your president, I will ensure you receive both. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Ibrahim turned to Salif, who had been standing quietly to the side, watching the scene unfold with wonder. Mr. Dow, the president said, thank you for your courage. You saved a man's life today. More than that, you reminded us all what citizenship truly means. Your daughter will be proud of you. Salif could only nod, too overcome with emotion to speak. The convoy drove away, leaving behind a police station full of officers who suddenly understood that the old ways, the easy assumptions, the lazy prejudices would no longer be tolerated. The presidential clinic was a world away from the conditions Isaka had known. Clean sheets, soft beds, doctors who spoke gently and actually listened to symptoms, nurses who brought food, real food, not scraps, and made sure he ate slowly so his starved stomach wouldn't rebel. They examined him thoroughly. Malnutrition, they diagnosed. Dehydration, early signs of tuberculosis that needed immediate treatment, a dozen minor ailments born of poverty and neglect. But nothing that couldn't be treated, they assured him. Nothing that rest, proper nutrition, and medicine couldn't heal. Isaka lay in the hospital bed that first night, clean for the first time in months, his belly full for the first time in weeks, and wept. Not tears of sorrow now, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. He thought of his children, who would eat tomorrow because of this miracle. He thought of his mother, who would receive the medicine she needed. He thought of his wife, whose tired, patient face would finally have reason to smile. But beneath the relief was something else, a gnawing shame. He had fallen so far. Once he had been a promising student, top of his class with a future that seemed limitless. Now he was a charity case, dependent on the mercy of his old classmate who had become president. The next morning, after a breakfast that seemed like a feast, Ibrahim came to visit. He pulled up a chair beside Isaka's bed and sat down like an old friend. "Not a head of state. Do you remember?" Ibrahim said with a slight smile. "The mathematics competition in our final year at St. Michel?" Isaka blinked, the memory surfacing after years buried under harder times. "You finished third. I finished first." "You finished first because you helped me understand calculus," Ibrahim said. "I would have failed that subject without you. You spent hours tutoring me after school, refusing any payment, saying that knowledge was meant to be shared." "That was a long time ago," Isaka said quietly. "The principle hasn't changed," Ibrahim replied. "You helped me then. Let me help you now." "Your Excellency—" "Ibrahim," the president interrupted gently. "Call me Ibrahim. We're friends, remember? The uniform and the title don't change that." Isaka's eyes filled with tears again. "I'm so ashamed, Ibrahim. Look at what I've become." "You're the president and I'm human," Ibrahim said firmly. "You're human, Isaka. You faced circumstances beyond your control." The economy collapsed. Jobs disappeared. Illness struck your family. None of that is your fault. There's no shame in struggling. The shame would be in refusing help when it's offered. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I need good people in this administration, Isaka. People who understand what poverty really means, not from books or reports, but from living it. People who remember what it's like to be dismissed and overlooked. People with empathy." From his briefcase, Ibrahim pulled out a folder and handed it to Isaka. "We're launching a new program, Work for All. It's designed to provide employment opportunities for the most vulnerable citizens. But more than that, it's designed to restore dignity. We need supervisors who understand that work isn't just about economic productivity. It's about self-respect." Isaka opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were details of the program: job training initiatives, placement services, support for families in crisis. "I want you to be one of the regional supervisors," Ibrahim said. "You'll help identify people who need work, match them with opportunities, provide training where needed, and ensure they're treated with respect. You'll use your experience, everything you've been through, to help others." I don't have qualifications," Isaka stammered. "I never finished university. I don't have certificates or—" "You have something more valuable," Ibrahim interrupted. "You have wisdom born of hardship. You have empathy. You have integrity. You asked for work, not charity, even when you were starving. Those qualities can't be taught in any university." He placed a hand on Isaka's shoulder. "The salary will be fair, enough to support your family comfortably, to get proper medical care for your mother, to send your children to good schools. You'll have an office, a staff to work with, and my full support." Isaka couldn't speak. His throat had closed with emotion. After months, years of being invisible, of being dismissed and degraded, someone was offering him not just a job, but a purpose. Not just income, but dignity. "I won't let you down," he finally managed to whisper. "I know you won't," Ibrahim said with quiet confidence. 3 days later, Isaka stood on a platform in Independence Square, wearing clean, pressed clothes that fit properly. His face filled out slightly from regular meals, his shoulders straight with renewed pride. Before him stretched a crowd of thousands, citizens who had gathered for the official launch of the Work for All program. President Ibrahim stood at the podium, speaking into microphones that carried his words across the square and beyond to radios throughout the nation. "My fellow citizens of Burkina Faso," Ibrahim began, his voice strong and clear. "Today marks a new chapter in our nation's story. For too long, we have accepted poverty as inevitable. We have treated our most vulnerable citizens as problems to be managed rather than people to be valued." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. But poverty is not a crime. Hardship is not a moral failing. When a person falls on difficult times, it doesn't diminish their worth or their dignity. Every human being, regardless of their economic status, deserves to be treated with respect. Every citizen deserves the opportunity to provide for their family through honest work. The crowd murmured with approval. "Last week," Ibrahim continued, "I encountered a situation that exemplifies both the worst and the best of what we can be as a nation. A good man, desperate to feed his hungry children, went seeking work. Instead of being given a chance to prove himself, he was dismissed, falsely accused, and arrested. He was punished not for any crime, but for the crime of being poor." The crowd grew silent, attentive. But one young man, a construction worker named Salif Dow, refused to accept this injustice. Despite the risk to his own livelihood, he traveled to the presidential villa to report what he had witnessed. He chose truth over safety, justice over convenience. He embodied the kind of citizenship that makes nations great. Ibrahim gestured for Salif to stand. The young man rose from his seat on the platform, his face flushed with embarrassment and pride as the crowd applauded. And the man who was wrongly accused, Isaka Sawadogo, stands beside me today. Not as a victim, but as an example of resilience. Not as a charity case, but as a valued member of this administration. Isaka stepped forward, and the applause grew louder. People in the crowd stood, showing respect for a man they didn't know but whose story they understood. Many had been in similar positions, dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than human because of their economic circumstances. The Work for All program, Ibrahim explained, is built on a simple principle. Every citizen deserves dignity. We will create pathways to employment for those who have been shut out. We will provide training for those who need skills. We will ensure fair treatment for those who have been exploited. And we will remember that a nation's strength is measured not by how it treats its elite, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. He placed a hand on Isaka's shoulder. "Mr. Sawadogo will serve as one of our regional supervisors. He will help others because he understands their struggles. He will treat every applicant with respect because he knows what it's like to be disrespected. He will fight for justice because he has experienced injustice." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters snapped photographs. Camera crews captured the moment. And across Burkina Faso, people listening on radios felt something shift, a sense that perhaps finally, someone in power actually understood their struggles. Isaka spoke briefly, his voice trembling but clear. "I stand before you not as a hero, but as someone who was given a second chance. President Ibrahim didn't just give me a job, he gave me back my dignity. He reminded me that my worth isn't determined by my bank account or my clothes, but by my character and my humanity." He looked out at the crowd, at faces that reflected his own past struggles. "To anyone out there who is struggling, who feels invisible and forgotten, I see you. This program sees you, and we will do everything in our power to ensure you have the opportunity to build a better life for yourself and your family." The applause was deafening, but not everyone was celebrating. In a modest house across the city, Ousmane Kabore sat in his armchair, his right leg elevated on a cushioned stool, wrapped in pristine white bandages. The fracture was healing well, the doctors had said. Another 2 weeks in the cast, some physical therapy, and he'd be back to normal. But his mood was anything but normal. The newspaper lay open on his lap. The headline screamed at him in bold letters, "President appoints wrongly accused man to national program." Below it was a large photograph of Isaka standing beside President Ibrahim. Both men smiling, Isaka's hand on a folder marked, "Work for All, Regional Supervisor." Ousmane stared at the photo until his eyes burned. His hands clenched the edges of the newspaper, crumpling it. His jaw worked as he ground his teeth. "How?" he muttered. "How is this possible?" His wife, Miriam, bustled in from the kitchen carrying his medication and a glass of water. She saw his face and sighed. "Ousmane, you need to let this go. The doctor said stress will slow your healing." "Let it go?" Ousmane barked, his voice rising. "That man, that beggar, pushed me and broke my leg. And now he's some kind of national hero? He has a government position? This is insanity." "The investigation said it was an accident," Miriam said carefully, setting the glass on the table beside him. "Multiple witnesses confirmed that you pushed him first and—" "Lies!" Ousmane shouted, slamming his fist on the arm of the chair. "My own workers turned against me." "They were intimidated, obviously. The presidential guards probably threatened them." Miriam said nothing. She had been married to Ousmane for 15 years, long enough to know when argument was futile. But she also knew the truth. She had spoken quietly to one of the workers' wives at the market, and the woman had told her what really happened. Her husband was not the victim in this story, though he insisted on seeing himself that way. Pride. It was always pride with Ousmane. The need to be right, to be respected, to be above others. It had served him well in his career, driving him to work harder, to demand excellence, to build a reputation. But now that same pride was poisoning him. "You should rest," she said softly. "The bone needs time to heal." But even as Ousmane's bone slowly mended, something else in him was breaking. Each day brought new reminders of Isaka's elevation. The newspapers ran follow-up stories. Radio programs interviewed people who had been helped by the Work for All initiative. Television broadcasts showed Isaka visiting work sites, speaking with applicants, actually listening to people's struggles. The man was being praised, celebrated, held up as an example of resilience and dignity. And Ousmane, the successful engineer, the respected professional, was forgotten. Worse than forgotten, he was the villain in this story. The man who had falsely accused an innocent person. The man who had been too proud to admit his mistake. His phone rang constantly with calls he didn't want to answer. Friends asking awkward questions. Business contacts suddenly unavailable for meetings. The construction company that had contracted his services for the next project sent a terse email suggesting they pursue other options. His reputation, built over 20 years of hard work, was crumbling. And it was all Isaka's fault. At least that's what Ousmane told himself. If that man had just accepted the money and left, if he had just admitted his guilt, if he hadn't somehow known the president, Ousmane's thoughts circled like vultures, picking at the corpse of his pride until there was nothing left but rage and a burning desire for revenge. Ousmane spent his days plotting. He couldn't accept that the fault was his own, that his hasty accusation and prideful refusal to admit error had created this situation. Instead, he focused all his anger on Isaka, constructing elaborate justifications for why revenge was not just justified but necessary. He must be taught a lesson, Ousmane muttered to himself, pacing his living room with the aid of a crutch. He's made a fool of me. The president may have been deceived, but I know the truth. I know what kind of man he really is. 2 weeks after the incident, when the cast was finally removed and Ousmane could walk with only a slight limp, he made a decision. He would reach out to Isaka. He would pretend to make peace. And in doing so, he would find a way to destroy the man who had destroyed him. His hands shook slightly as he dialed Isaka's new office number, a number that had been published in the newspaper as part of the Work for All program's public outreach. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Work for All Ouagadougou region. Isaka Sawadogo speaking. Hearing that voice, steady, professional, confident, sparked fresh anger in Ousmane's chest. But he forced his voice to remain calm, even gentle. Mr. Sawadogo, he said. This is Ousmane Kabore. Silence on the line. Then, Mr. Kabore, hello. I'm calling because I owe you an apology, Ousmane said, each word tasting like ash in his mouth. I was wrong. I was in pain and I lashed out at you. The investigation proved you were innocent and I'm sorry, more silence. Ousmane could almost hear the other man thinking, weighing the words. I appreciate you calling, Isaka finally said. I understand you were hurt and angry. I hold no grudge against you. I'd like to apologize in person. Usman continued. If you would allow it. Perhaps you could come to my home for tea? I feel terrible about what happened, and I'd like to make amends properly. There was a long pause. Usman held his breath. That's very kind of you, Isaka said slowly. Yes, I think that would be good. When would be convenient? Tomorrow morning? Usman suggested. Around 10 o'clock? Tomorrow at 10, Isaka agreed. Thank you, Mr. Caboret. I believe in reconciliation. I'm glad we can move past this. As am I, Usman lied smoothly. I'll see you tomorrow. He hung up and sat back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. The fool had actually agreed. The naive, trusting fool would walk right into his home. That night, Usman went to see a man he knew from his construction days, a rough individual who dealt in materials that weren't always acquired legally. Among other services, this man could acquire things that weren't supposed to be available to civilians. Things like certain chemicals. I need something that will cause severe illness, Usman said bluntly, after making sure they were alone in the man's workshop. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough to require hospitalization. Something that can be mixed with tea without being obvious. The man, whose name Usman had never learned and didn't want to know, regarded him with hooded eyes. That's a dangerous request, friend. Can you do it or not? Usman snapped. Money changed hands. A small packet, white powder in a sealed bag, was handed over with whispered instructions about dosage and timing. This will make someone very sick, the man warned. Hospital sick. You better be sure about this. I'm sure, Usman said coldly. The next morning, he prepared carefully. He brewed a pot of tea, set out his best cups, and practiced his apologetic expression in the mirror. When he heard the car pull up outside precisely at 10 o'clock, he was ready. Isaka arrived looking healthy and well-rested, wearing simple but clean business attire. The transformation from the skeletal, desperate man at the construction site gate was remarkable. Proper nutrition and relief from chronic stress had allowed his body to begin recovering. His eyes were clearer, his posture straighter. Mr. Caboret, Isaka said, extending his hand for a shake. How is your leg healing? Much better, thank you, Usman replied, the lie smooth as oil on his tongue. Please, come in. Sit down. They settled in the neat living room, and Usman poured tea into 2 cups from the pot he'd prepared. In 1 cup, the one he would give to Isaka, he had already dissolved the powder. It left no trace in the amber liquid. I want you to know, Usman said, handing the poisoned cup to Isaka, that I truly regret what happened. I was in pain and not thinking clearly. Can you forgive me? Isaka took the cup and held it, but didn't immediately drink. Something in Usman's tone felt off, too practiced, too smooth. I forgive you, Isaka said simply. Holding grudges only harms the one who holds them. Life has taught me that much. He thought about ignoring it, pretending he'd never heard the plan. But those children's faces kept appearing in his mind. That little girl who'd hugged her father's legs so tightly, so trusting that her world was safe. Bemba made a decision. He pulled up the contact information. He'd gathered for Isaka Sawadogo and made a call. Isaka was helping his daughter with her homework, simple addition problems that she was tackling with fierce concentration when his phone rang. Unknown number. Sawadogo speaking, he answered, using his free hand to steady his son's juice cup before it toppled. Mr. Sawadogo, my name is Bemba. You don't know me, but I need to tell you something important. The man's voice was rough but urgent, without the smooth tones of a scam artist. Isaka felt his attention sharpen. I'm listening. I was hired by Usman Caboret to follow you today, to photograph your house, your family, your routine. Isaka's blood went cold. He stood up abruptly, moving to the bedroom so his children wouldn't hear the conversation. Why are you telling me this? He asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the fear rising in his chest. Because he just called me again. He wants me to come to your house tonight, to hurt you, to scare your family. I refused, but he's going to find someone else who won't refuse. You need to know so you can protect yourself. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't some kind of trap? Check your email, Bemba said. I just sent you the photos I took today and a recording of the conversation I just had with Caboret. I can't stop him, but I can give you evidence and warning. What you do with it is up to you. Isaka opened his email on his phone. Sure enough, there was a message from an unknown address. The photos showed his house from angles he recognized, his car, even himself arriving home with his children running to greet him. Then he played the audio file. Usman's voice, clear and unmistakable, ordering violence against him and his family. "Thank you," Isaka said quietly. "You may have saved our lives." "I'm sorry I took his money in the first place," Bemba said. "But I draw the line at hurting families. Good luck, Mr. Sawadogo. Be careful." The call ended. Isaka stood in his bedroom, his mind racing. He could call the police, but would they take it seriously? Would they act quickly enough? Usman was a respected engineer with connections. Isaka, despite his new position, was still seen by many as the beggar who got lucky. Who would they believe? No, he needed to go higher. He needed to call the person who had already demonstrated a commitment to justice. He pulled up the contact information for President Ibrahim's office, a number he'd been given for emergencies, and made the call. Within an hour, Isaka's modest home had become the center of a covert operation. Plainclothes security officers had taken up positions in neighboring houses, their presence invisible to any casual observer. Technical specialists had installed hidden cameras covering all approaches to the property. Armed response teams waited in unmarked vehicles 2 streets away, ready to move at a moment's notice. President Ibrahim himself had taken personal interest in the case. He sat in the command center, a temporary setup in a secured building nearby, watching the feeds from the cameras, his expression grim. "This is what happens when pride is allowed to fester unchecked," he said to Colonel Bambra, who stood beside him. Usman Traoré could have admitted his mistake, apologized genuinely, and moved on with his life. Instead, he let his ego consume him until he's planning violence against an innocent family. "If he comes tonight, we'll have him," the colonel assured him. "Every approach is covered. He won't get within 20 meters of the house." Ibrahim nodded, but his mind was troubled. "How many other Usmains are out there?" he mused. "Men who would rather destroy others than admit they were wrong? How do we build a just society when pride is valued more than truth?" "By examples," Bambra said. "By showing that justice applies to everyone, that connections and status don't protect people from consequences." They settled in to wait. Inside the house, Isaka tried to maintain normality for his children's sake. He read them bedtime stories, tucked them in, kissed their foreheads. His wife, Aminata, knew something was wrong. He'd told her the basics, but she trusted him to handle it. They'd survived hunger, illness, and desperation together. They would survive this too. Isaka checked the locks on the doors and windows, though he knew the real security was outside, invisible, but present. Then they waited. Midnight approached, and the residential street grew quiet. Lights in neighboring houses switched off one by one. The temperature dropped to something almost comfortable after the day's scorching heat. At 12:15 a.m., a figure appeared at the far end of the street, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to be noticed. The security cameras picked him up immediately, infrared revealing details invisible to the naked eye. Usman Traoré, dressed entirely in black, carrying a small backpack, moved from shadow to shadow with the incompetence of someone who had never actually needed to be stealthy before. He'd parked his car 3 blocks away and walked, thinking this made him untraceable. He had a gun in his waistband, illegally obtained from the same man who'd sold him the poison, and a knife in his pocket. In the command center, Ibrahim leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Let him get close," he ordered quietly. "I want there to be no question about his intent." Usman reached the low fence surrounding Isaka's property. He looked left and right, seeing nothing in the darkness, not realizing that multiple eyes were watching his every move. Slowly, carefully, he climbed over the fence, his injured leg protesting the movement but functioning well enough. He crept toward the house, his hand moving to the gun at his waist. In his mind, he was justified. He was seeking justice for the wrong done to him. He was punishing a deceiver, a manipulator, a man who had stolen his reputation and deserved to suffer. Pride had poisoned his thoughts so thoroughly that he genuinely believed he was the victim. that what he was about to do was righteous revenge rather than cold-blooded violence. He was 5 meters from the front door when the floodlights blazed to life, turning night into day. The sudden illumination blinded him, and he stumbled, raising his hand to shield his eyes. "Freeze! Police!" The shout came from multiple directions simultaneously. Ousmane's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, not to use it, perhaps, but in a panicked gesture of someone caught utterly off guard. It was the wrong move. Security officers materialized from the shadows, moving with professional speed. One tackled Ousmane before he could draw the weapon, bringing him down hard on the packed earth. Another secured his arms. A third pulled the gun from his waistband and the knife from his pocket, holding them up for the cameras to record. "Let me go," Ousmane shouted, struggling against the hands that held him. "You don't understand. This man, he's a fraud. He's deceived everyone." "We understand perfectly," one of the officers said coldly. "You're under arrest for attempted home invasion, illegal weapons possession, and conspiracy to commit assault." They hauled him to his feet and cuffed his wrists behind his back. Ousmane looked around wildly, finally seeing the cameras. The officers emerging from their positions, the careful setup of the trap he'd walked into. And standing in the doorway of the house, safe behind the security officers, was Isaka Sawadogo, looking at him with an expression not of triumph but of profound sadness. "Why couldn't you just let it go?" Isaka called out softly. "I forgave you. The president forgave you. Why wasn't that enough?" Ousmane had no answer. Or rather, he had no answer that made sense even to himself anymore. The rage that had driven him here, that had seemed so justified in his own mind, suddenly appeared for what it was: petty, destructive, shameful. He hung his head as they led him to the waiting police vehicle, all the fight draining out of him at once. President Ibrahim watched from the command center until Ousmane was secured in the vehicle and the operation was officially concluded. Then he stood and prepared to visit the Sawadogo house personally. "Mr. President," Colonel Bambra said carefully, "it's very late. Perhaps this could wait until morning." "No," Ibrahim said firmly. "Isaka and his family were terrorized tonight because they were connected to me, because I chose to do the right thing. The least I can do is ensure they're all right and know they're safe." The trial of Ousmane Traoré was swift but thorough. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance photos he'd commissioned, the recorded phone calls ordering violence, the security camera footage showing him armed and breaking into private property with clear intent to harm. His lawyer tried to argue temporary insanity brought on by pain medication. The judge was unimpressed. "Mr. Traoré," the judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's murmur, "you are a respected professional, a man of education and means. When you made a mistake, when you falsely accused an innocent man, you had every opportunity to admit your error, to apologize, to make amends. Instead, you chose pride. You chose revenge. You chose to blame others for consequences you yourself created." She looked at him with something approaching pity. "Your injured leg has long since healed, but your injured pride consumed you until you were willing to commit violence against a man who had forgiven you, who wished you no harm." The sentence was harsh. 7 years in prison for attempted assault, illegal weapons possession, conspiracy to commit violence, and abuse of his position to intimidate witnesses at the construction site. With good behavior, he might serve 5, but his career was over, his reputation destroyed beyond any hope of repair. As they led him away in handcuffs, Ousmane finally understood what he had lost through his own stubborn pride. His wife, Mariam, had filed for divorce. His children refused to speak to him. His professional colleagues had distanced themselves so completely that his name became an embarrassing footnote in conversations about integrity. He had had everything: respect, success, family, security, and he had thrown it all away because he couldn't admit he'd been wrong about a poor man at a construction gate. 3 months after Ousmane's conviction, President Ibrahim addressed the nation once more. His speech was broadcast on every television and radio station in Burkina Faso, and people gathered in homes, shops, and community centers to listen. "My fellow citizens," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and deep feeling. Today I want to talk to you about the case of Ousmane Traoré, not to celebrate his punishment, but to understand the lessons his downfall teaches us all. He paused, letting the silence draw attention. Ousmane Traoré was not an evil man. He was a successful engineer, a provider for his family, a contributor to our society. But when faced with a choice between admitting error and protecting his pride, he chose pride, and that choice set him on a path that destroyed everything he had built. Ibrahim leaned forward, his expression earnest. Pride is perhaps the most dangerous of human failings because it blinds us to truth. When we are more concerned with being right than with being righteous, when we value our reputation more than our integrity, we become capable of terrible things. Ousmane could have said, "I made a mistake." 3 simple words that would have cost him nothing but would have prevented immeasurable harm. Instead, his pride whispered, "You are right. They are wrong. You must make them pay." And he listened to that whisper until it became a roar that drowned out reason. Compassion and common sense. The president's voice softened. But let me also talk about Isaka Sawadogo, because his story is the other half of this lesson. Isaka had every reason to hate Ousmane. He was falsely accused, arrested, humiliated. His hungry children watched their father dragged away by police. His sick mother suffered because he couldn't be there to care for her. Yet when I asked Isaka if he could forgive Ousmane, he said yes without hesitation. When Ousmane called, pretending to apologize, Isaka went to his house genuinely seeking reconciliation. Even after Ousmane tried to poison him, even after Ousmane planned to harm his family, Isaka's first reaction was sadness, not satisfaction at his enemy's capture. Ibrahim stood, gesturing for emphasis. Isaka showed us what true strength looks like. Not the false strength of pride that refuses to bend, but the real strength of humility that can forgive even those who wish us harm. He defeated hatred not through revenge, but by refusing to let hatred take root in his own heart. The cameras showed people across the nation listening with rapt attention. In Ousmane's former neighborhood, some wept for the man they'd known who had fallen so far. In Isaka's neighborhood, people nodded with recognition, seeing their own struggles reflected in his story. A nation does not rise through power alone, Ibrahim continued. It rises when its people choose mercy over revenge. It rises when we value truth over face-saving. It rises when we remember that every person, regardless of their economic status, their education, their connections, deserves dignity and justice. He gestured to where Isaka sat in the audience, looking uncomfortable with the attention but dignified in his simple suit. Isaka showed us that forgiveness is not weakness but wisdom. That character is more valuable than credentials. That a man's worth is determined not by his bank account, but by his integrity. The camera pulled back to show the full assembly, government officials, ordinary citizens, students, workers, all listening to their young president speak with a moral clarity that inspired some and challenged others. So I ask you all, Ibrahim concluded, when you face the choice between admitting error and protecting pride, which will you choose? When someone weaker than you needs help, will you see them as a burden or as a fellow human deserving dignity? When someone wrongs you, will you seek revenge or reconciliation? These choices, made daily by millions of citizens, determine what kind of nation we become. Let Ousmane's tragedy remind us of the cost of pride, and let Isaka's grace remind us of the power of forgiveness. May we build a Burkina Faso where truth matters more than ego, where justice protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful, and where every citizen, from the presidential villa to the construction site, remembers that we are all equally human, equally deserving of dignity, equally responsible for creating the society we wish to inhabit. The speech concluded, and across the nation people sat in thoughtful silence. Some had been moved to tears. Others felt challenged in their own prideful tendencies. Still others felt hope that perhaps, just perhaps, their country was moving toward a version of itself worth believing in. 2 years later, the Work for All program had expanded to every region of Burkina Faso. Thousands of people who had been dismissed as unemployable, who had been overlooked and undervalued, found opportunities to work with dignity. The program had reduced extreme poverty by 12%, a modest number in statistics, but representing tens of thousands of families lifted from desperation. Isaka Sawadogo had become the national director of the program, overseeing its implementation across the country. He traveled constantly, visiting regional offices, meeting with workers, ensuring that the program's original mission, dignity through honest work, remained central to its operation. His children attended good schools. His mother, now recovered from her illness, helped care for the grandchildren and told anyone who would listen about the day the president himself had saved her son. Aminata had opened a small shop with money they'd saved, selling vegetables and household goods, happy to contribute to their household while maintaining her independence. Salif Dao, the young construction worker who had risked everything to report the truth, had been promoted to site supervisor at his company. His courage had become legendary among workers, proof that speaking truth to power could sometimes lead to justice rather than punishment. He taught his daughter, Fatumata, now 4 years old, that bravery wasn't about being unafraid. It was about doing the right thing, even when you were afraid. And Ousmane Kabore sat in his prison cell, finally understanding what he had lost through his stubborn refusal to admit one simple mistake. He had 5 years left to serve, years he spent in isolation and reflection, years that stripped away every last vestige of the pride that had destroyed him. He wrote letters to his children, though they rarely responded. He wrote to his ex-wife apologizing for failing their family, and eventually, painfully, he wrote to Isaka Sawadogo. The letter took him weeks to compose, each draft crumpled and thrown away as inadequate. Finally, he wrote simply,